Good evening and greetings. Welcome to the Menil. We have some seats up front if people want to get up closer. Obviously, we have slides, you'll see them and so forth, but there's still some seats up front. My name is Joseph Newland. I'm the Director of Publishing here, and I'm happy to be here when we have a book event. The Menil is, I feel really lucky to be the publisher here because I actually moved to Houston 7 years ago and found out this is a really great book town. So I want to thank you all for coming out for books, for coming out for art, and for coming here for both art and books and for Jay Wehnert's talk. As you can see, we're here for Outsider Art in Texas, Lone Stars, and Jay has been a person who's been getting people and art together for a long time. In 2011, he started something called intuitiveye.org, which is sort of his umbrella organization. He's a curator, he's a writer, he's a sometimes dealer, he's a sometimes introducer of people to art. He writes books. He also writes for various local publications and also one of the really important organs internationally on self-taught and outsider art, Raw Vision. I still have trouble saying self-taught art. I would want to say self-taught artists because as an editor, self-taught art means like, well, of course the art didn't have to have a professor. It didn't. But anyway, we'll leave that one alone because Jay can tell you more. But I think one of the things that I really like about his approach is he's called his umbrella organization intuitiveye.org. And he has a good definition of that, which I'll just lead into introducing our author tonight, Jay Wehnert. The intuitive eye belongs to both the artist and the viewer. The intuitive eye belongs to both the artist and the viewer. The artist is able to see directly to the soul of their subject and communicate it with the viewer who is open. So let's open up.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. And really appreciate being here at the Menil. I'd like to thank everyone who's played a part in organizing my presentation and presentation of my book tonight. The Menil has been a very central point in my interest in outsider and self-taught art and artists. They've been essential in both stimulating and maintaining a lot of my interests and helping me develop them, from exhibiting work by artists such as Charles Delkchau and Frank Jones and Henry Ray Clark in wonderful exhibitions here at the museum, to most recently the museum's acquisition of the Smither collection, which had a wonderful opening and exhibition here. Those things have been very important to me. And also, in no small way, the bookstore has been very central to so many people, including my own interest and exposure to outsider art. From the time I first came to Houston in the early 90s, when Sheila Rosenstein was at the bookstore, to the present time when Paul Forsyth is running the store. The store has always been a great place and a place to show art, to see art in an informal, non-gallery setting that has been very helpful in its way. Writing my book, Outsider Art in Texas, Lone Stars, is just my latest chapter in what has now, for me, become a lifelong interest in outsider and self-taught art. What I'll try to do tonight is talk a little bit about where the origins of my interests came and how they've informed my own thinking and understanding about this art. I'll talk a bit about what I've thought through for myself as some of the core ideas and concepts connected to the art, and then follow up with the stories of 3 of the artists that I include in the book that all happen to be Houstonians. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. I grew up without much of a formal education in art, without much exposure to both historical art or contemporary art. In fact, my family kind of dissuaded my brother and I from being very interested in art. Being 45 miles from Washington, D.C., we were taught that it wasn't important to go down to Washington and see all of the snooty museums. We were better off staying in Baltimore. So I didn't grow up with much exposure to conventional art and art education, but I did grow up in Baltimore that had many of its own ways of exposing one to art. My parents and grandparents grew up in some of Baltimore's working class neighborhoods. And in the 1930s and 40s, there were itinerant painters who came to those neighborhoods and would paint people's window screens. These are Baltimore neighborhoods where, as you can see from this example, there are no lawns, there are no trees. The houses come right up to the sidewalk. In the evening, people sit out on their stoops, and they are surrounded by these bucolic country scenes of which they might be aspiring to, as we say in Baltimore, to live out in the county. Being in the county and out of the city is an attraction. But I grew up visiting my grandparents and where my parents grew up in these neighborhoods that had painted screens. And they almost all are stereotypical in their content. The red roof cottage in a bucolic country scene with a body of water, often with swans. I've since learned more about the Baltimore screen painters and what a community of self-taught artists they were, working in this very unique to Baltimore tradition. Painted screens are not found anywhere else. I can refer you to a wonderful book that came out about 3 years ago by the Maryland folklorist Elaine F., which documents her almost lifelong efforts to both document and research the history of Baltimore screens. What I did grow up with taking away from this was this idea of finding unexpected art in unexpected places, made by some of the most unexpected people. One of which included a Baltimore celebrity named Johnny Eck. Johnny Eck was a famous sideshow performer. He traveled the world as a world-famous half-man. Johnny Eck was a raconteur of the sideshow world and entertainment history. He was also beloved in Baltimore. Johnny Eck was a person who I grew up knowing about, as opposed to many of the other more luminary Baltimoreans I might have learned about. I knew about Johnny Eck. That, in retrospect, also tells me some very important things about the Baltimore that I grew up in, is that Johnny Eck was both a celebrity and someone to know about. Later in his life, Johnny Eck became a screen painter. And he in his home, though I was a little early to know about Johnny, was quite a destination for people to go hear Johnny's stories about the sideshow, his life in it, and then also to have your screens painted. as I mentioned, I did not go and have much exposure to museums as a young child and a boy growing up. But growing up did include for us an annual visit to Hausner's restaurant in Baltimore. Hausner's restaurant was decorated, as you see, with the owner's generations-long collection of European art that they would bring back from European tours. And over our annual sour beef and dumplings dinner, which for me sometimes took place under that nude statue, which was quite a distraction to a young boy trying to maintain his equanimity in a somewhat formal restaurant. This was one of my annual exposures to art. Again, in retrospect, for those who know us here in the audience, it was at first surprising to me how much our home has come to resemble Hausner's, with much different art, but still packed with the art that we love. And lastly, in my pantheon of Baltimore influences is John Waters, of course. John Waters depicted in his films a Baltimore that is very real and was very real to me. I recall John saying he would have his premieres at the Senator Theater in Baltimore. And I recall him telling a story once of a kind of high society, blue-haired lady encountering him after one of his openings and saying, "Mr. Waters, I've always heard of your films, but I didn't know you were making documentaries." But pictured here with Divine, again, I was growing up in a Baltimore where the kind of transgression that John Waters represented, the transgender star of his movies, were cultural touchstones in Baltimore. People that Baltimore both embraced and celebrated. And I've come to realize how influential that has been in the kind of arts that I've come to appreciate. I have a quote from John who said, "I would never want to live anywhere but Baltimore. You can look far and wide, but you'll never discover a stranger city with such an extreme style. It's as if every eccentric in the South decided to move north, ran out of gas in Baltimore, and decided to stay." And in many respects, that is true. So, in many ways, Baltimore sensitized me to the qualities of what I would come to be introduced to in outsider art. The idea of the self-taught, the idea of the unconventional, the outcast, the misfit, the marginalized. Baltimore kind of poised me to be ready for outsider art when I did see it. Where I did eventually see outsider art was through the art interest that I did have going into my young adulthood, which was music. I was keenly and still am very interested in music. And in the mid-'80s, when I started to see images of outsider artists on the album covers of bands and artists that I was interested in, that got my attention. Along with, at this period of time in the mid-'80s, outsider and self-taught art was beginning to get some popular press. I had heard about it, read about it. I don't know that I paid a lot of attention to it in the moment, but when I started seeing it attached to artists and musicians like David Byrne and Talking Heads, or REM and Michael Stipe, all had images or videos that were taken throughout the South featuring outsider artists like Howard Finster. What also occurred in the mid-'80s was both Victoria, my wife, and my exposure to Paul Darmafal, also known as the Baltimore Glass Man. Paul lived about a mile from our house in Baltimore and worked along a busy sidewalk stretch of a busy highway, creating out of shards of broken glass what he thought of as roadside signs. Paul was perplexed by any conversation about his work that referred to them as art. He only wanted to know if you got the message of the sign that he was creating to express his idiosyncratic beliefs about life and health and how to stay right in the world. We both spent 5 or 6 years spending a lot of time with Paul, and that firsthand experience of him and the isolation that was at the core of his life, how his eccentric ideas, his very kind of initially, for strangers, off-putting manner, really served in many ways to isolate him from the world at large. He was largely a loner. He was suspicious of others. And as I said, others were suspicious of him because of his many eccentricities. But getting to know him as an artist and as a person, personally, again, started to fuel my interest in what he was doing and the kind of art and artist that he was and what he was producing. We, of course, started collecting Paul's work when he would deem us ready and capable of having it. What's also interesting in terms of his understanding of his work versus mine, thinking of them as roadside signs, it was very important for him that they be outdoors. He did not hold on to the idea that someone would take a work of his and hang it on their wall like a piece of art. He only wanted to know, once he heard that those were some of the circumstances that his collectors were doing, he only wanted to know if they were near an open window where they would get the fresh air like they would get when they were hanging from the fence where he would hang them outside. That was the most important thing for him. As I started my path of what was now becoming very much an intellectual curiosity as well as an acquisitional one, I started wanting to learn as much as I can about the artists and came to a better appreciation of what some of the underpinnings of what was then in the mid-'80s being called outsider art. And that search began and took me to the work and thinking of Jean Dubuffet, who in the 30s and the 40s, as a French painter and sculptor in the avant-garde, was devoted to the idea of finding an art form and a way of expression that, in his estimation, was more genuine, more real, more authentic than the societally sanctioned and condoned and institutional art of his time. Art that was fueled by patronage, art that was fueled by ambition. He was railing against that and seeking art that was, for him, representative of a more genuine creativity. And where Dubuffet found that for himself were in mental asylums throughout Western Europe. He found artists in asylums who were living in his mind, extreme isolation. Isolation both because of their psychiatric condition and their views of the world and society, but also their institutionalization served to isolate them from society and the culture at large. Most notable among Dubuffet's artists is Adolf Wolfli, who I did not include an image from, but would encourage everyone to seek out. Dubuffet talked about the works created in solitude and from these pure and authentic creative processes, and really highlighted in his writings this essential isolation of the artist from the influences of the society at large and specifically the artistic and cultural institutions. Dubuffet's writings and his presentation, while he did present them here in the United States, were largely a European phenomenon, and his writings were in French. It wasn't until about 40 years later, in 1972, when Roger Cardinal, an English scholar and art critic, published his book was titled Outsider Art. Cardinal's book reflected his understanding of what art brut was. He had initially thought that he was going to call his work, in reference to Dubuffet's term, art brut, he was going to call his book art brut. But his English publisher thought that an English-speaking audience wouldn't take to a French title. So the story is that they sat around for the better part of a day trying to think of a good English title, a catchy, as Roger has said, a catchy English title for his book on art brut. And they came up with Outsider Art. So in many ways, from an historical perspective, outsider art, the term that Roger Cardinal coined, was meant to be synonymous with Dubuffet's art brut. What occurred, as his publisher had hoped, was that it did have a ready audience, both in English-speaking Europe and Britain, and then into the United States, where that idea of the outsider artist began to take hold, which then, fast forward another decade into the 80s, is where I encountered it. But what occurred as outsider art and that idea of outsider art took hold was that the nature of the isolation of the outsider artist need not be limited to those with psychiatric diagnoses and psychiatric residencies. That outsider artists, the idea, the concept of the outsider could be thought of in broader terms. It could be attached and applied to artists and their lives that involve a cultural isolation, an economic isolation, a geographic isolation, or even an isolation like with Paul Darmafal, an isolation that's based on a belief system, maybe even their experience of spirituality and the experience of visionary phenomena. But Roger Cardinal was the propelling force around those words, outsider art, which have come into common parlance now. The idea that I've tried to convey in my book, and that often comes up in conversations about this, is that I think both Dubuffet and Roger Cardinal were not trying to define artists or define art or to create a category for artists to be in or to be out. What they were trying to do by choosing the words that they did, because we only have words to convey these ideas, were to convey a concept or an idea about what is at the core of the art that they were trying to describe and to be advocates for. And so it's this idea of the isolation, it's the idea, the concept of it that's at the core of the terms, not so much their definition or a category. And so for me, this essential isolation at the core of the outsider artist became what I chose to be the animating idea underlying my book as I began to assemble it and organize it and write. So I'll talk about 3 of the artists that I've included of the 11 of the outsider artists from Texas in the book. They happen to all 3 be Houstonians, and are all of their stories are imbued with some forms of this essential isolation that plays out throughout much of their lives, and that including their creative lives. The first artist is Charles Delkchau. He was born in Prussia in 1830 and emigrated to Texas as a young man, arriving in the port of Galveston. He came here with skills as a butcher and set up a work life as a butcher. At some point, for a short period of time, perhaps 5 years, he traveled to California for the gold rush, but returned back to Houston, to Texas, really, Richmond, before coming to Houston. Delkchau's life was marked by many levels of the isolation that characterizes these artists. One, he arrived alone from Prussia to Texas, essentially, from what everyone is able to see from his records, effectively cutting himself off from all of his family. Apparently no other family members followed him to Texas, as sometimes do with immigrant families. So he was here alone. Throughout his adult life, he experienced the loss of both of his wives and all of their children to disease and accident. And it was only until the last 2 decades of his life, when he had come to Houston to live with his last remaining stepdaughter, who had married into the Stelzig family. And for a while, the aging Charles worked at the Stelzig Saddlery and Leather Goods Company, but was too grumpy to be a public employee. And so Charles was apparently sent home. But during the last 2 decades of his life, he essentially, though he lived in a busy household with his stepdaughter and her many children, he had essentially reclused himself to an upstairs bedroom, almost an attic room, where he spent most of his days. The family was apparently happy to have grumpy old Charles up in the attic and out of being in such a sour frame of mind. But he did, again, participate with his family. It wasn't until some 30 or 40 years after his death and a fire at the house where the product of what Charles was doing in that attic came to light. He had been producing what is at least a 14-volume series of hand-bound books that chronicle his participation in a secret society of men who were creating lighter-than-air flying machines. He was, in his writings, he was both an author and an illustrator, the draftsman of this group, and they were called the Sonora Flight Club, concurrent with his time spent in California, possibly. The book contains detailed drawings, illustrations of the flying machines, done in wonderful and in sometimes prescient detail, like there are people who are studying Delkchau's drawings, and like Michelangelo's drawings of machines, describe how some of his mechanical devices predate such things being invented, particularly landing gear. This is from someone who at least expressed no previous knowledge of aeronautics, aeronautical mechanics, or any interest in them to anyone that he knew, but was making at the rate of about one a day these drawings and paintings in watercolor, collage, and drawing that illustrated his books. The books, after picking up the story after the fire, were left on the sidewalk, where they were eventually salvaged by Fred Johnson, who had an antique and junk shop here in Houston. And they languished at Fred's for quite a while, until they were seen by my good friend Mary Jane Victor, who's here tonight. Mary Jane saw these books, and Fred engaged her as someone who had access to Mrs. de Menil and encouraged Mary Jane to present them to her, which she did arrange. Mrs. de Menil acquired 4 of the books, which are here at the Menil collection. She was apparently amused by the fact that her initials showed up in some of the drawings, the DM, which is one of Delkchau's codes for the secret gas that apparently propelled the machines. Later in life, Delkchau's paintings became more ephemeral in their way, looser. He used more watercolor. They became more like works of art, and not so much like elaborate mechanical drawings. They take on a different aspect, as this drawing shows. But his life and his work, again, he did all this, and keeping in mind he never told anyone what he was doing. These works would not have been found except by happenstance. It always makes me wonder how much art I walk by on a typical day that I might not see. What's in that dumpster? What's in that trash pile? Sometimes I do stop. Sometimes not, though. The second artist I'll talk about is Henry Ray Clark, another artist whose work is here at the Menil collection. Henry Ray Clark was born in East Texas and came to Houston as a teenager. He was leaving the limited opportunities in Bartlett, Texas, for a young African-American man in the aftermath of the Depression and in Jim Crow South. He traveled to Houston with an uncle who was going to show him the way of street life. His uncle was a gambler and a hustler, and Henry quickly took to that life, becoming quite a street hustler and small-time criminal of his own. Henry was a boldly handsome man and acquired the nickname either through his own saying or others as the Magnificent Pretty Boy, a name that we can all aspire to. Henry deserved it. Henry's life of small-time crime also coincided with Texas's 3-strike laws. So Henry's successive convictions for drug dealing, pimping, money lending, hustling, resulted in him getting extensive prison terms, and he spent much of his adult life in various Texas prisons, most in Huntsville. And while in prison, Henry began drawing, and he drew his fantastical nighttime excursions out of his cell into other worlds. He drew with make-do materials of unfolded manila envelopes and ballpoint pens that he could either buy from the commissary or scavenge around the prison. And all of these works involve his depiction of the interstellar destination where his travels take him, a character who he often illustrates and would see in that galaxy, and then he identifies them at the top of the drawing. Each of the drawings have similar motifs surrounded by design, the interior with the outer space and the alien being that he encounters. For Henry, he said that as long as he could draw, he would never be imprisoned. He would always be able to escape. I knew Henry when he was out of prison and living here in Houston. And the dualities in Henry's life were striking to me. He was this hard-boiled street character, but was eternally optimistic and good-hearted in his approach to the people who he loved and liked or visited him, and who had the opportunity and the means to buy some of his drawings. But Henry had this remarkable soft side, which is illustrated in this last drawing, which includes the title, "I am the day star, a light that shineth in a dark place. I shall arise in your heart." I've come to take the idea that in many ways, the being, the powerful being, the alien being in the center of Henry's drawings are in many ways him, beginning each of his titles, I am, is a clue for me. Henry often talked about himself in the most hyperbolic of terms as well. But his drawings of his extraterrestrial travels are quite remarkable. For him, they were a form of transformation, a form of escape and freedom. The last artist who I'll talk about is another personal story, Richard Gordon Kendal. I was at a party one evening, and a friend who was a lawyer downtown told me he thought he saw a homeless man on his walk to and from his parking garage who seemed to be drawing, but that he hadn't approached him and asked him about it. He was reluctant to do so, but he knew that that was the kind of thing that I did. So he told me where the corner was. It was in the shadows of the new construction for Minute Maid Park on La Branch, near Star of Hope Mission, where he had seen this seemingly homeless man drawing. So I started staking out this corner after work each day. I would drive by, it would be busy rush hour traffic. And so I really couldn't stop. There's no parking on the streets at that time, but I would look at that corner trying to see if there was someone there who vaguely fit my friend's description. And it took me about 3 weeks and several weekend morning visits before I finally saw a man with a shopping cart, overdressed for the warm Houston day, pull over his cart and sit down on the sidewalk and pull out from his shopping cart a pack of things that he began drawing on. So I walked over and greeted him and found and was introduced to Richard Gordon Kendal, who was very welcoming of my curiosity and my interests, and proceeded to not empty, but pull out of his carts many of his drawings of downtown Houston buildings. I spent about the next 4 to 5 years spending time with Richard, learning more about him and what this art making was all about for him. He described for me how, when I met Richard, he was in his mid-60s, I would say, maybe approaching 70. He said he had begun wondering what he might do in his retirement and thought that he would draw. He thought that he would stimulate his brain and his memory from looking at the buildings that surrounded him and then go back to his place where he stayed and draw them from memory, which is what he spent when he wasn't eking out a living on the street. He spent doing. Each of his buildings, in many ways, stand alone, much like Richard did in his own environment. He was really invisible to most of the people who were walking by him and around him through that busy downtown area. His buildings stand in isolation. I notice, and you may notice, of course, there are no people in any of the tableaus. The buildings are not depicted functioning as they function during their busy day. Richard's main idea, as he talked about his drawing, was that they capture the surface texture of the building. He was not so interested And whether he was successful in representing the building accurately, he was most interested in capturing the texture of the facades. Another interesting note about Richard, as I got to know him initially, of course, this guy started taking out all these drawings, and the acquisitional side of me, I kind of kept it contained, but my brain was very engaged with these drawings that this guy was showing me. And of course, at that time, I offered Richard to buy one from him. He had it's not accurate to say he had no interest in that. It was clear to me he had never considered that anyone would have that interest in his work. I came to learn that he had never showed them to anyone. And during the 4 to 5 years that I knew him, he reported that he had not shown them to anyone since showing them to me when we would visit. His making of them was only really for himself, to satisfy the needs that they served for him. I think I was an accidental occurrence within the art creating world that he had created for himself. This is maybe my favorite, the Republic Bank building, now known as the Bank of America building, downtown, Philip Johnson building. It captures so many of Richard's outsider artist characteristics and embody them in one work. They are quite remarkable, and I was pleased to be able to present him and his story to me personally in my book. I thank you all for being here and listening. We'll spend some time we have available with any questions or conversation. Glad to do that and open that up. Thank you.
And I have a mic here. If anybody has questions, you just raise your hand.
Mary Jane?
Oh, thank you. Did the last artist that you talked about, is he still alive, or did he ever show his drawings anymore to anyone?
Richard disappeared. I've taken to saying the last time I saw Richard was the last time I saw him. We never had regular appointments. I would drop in and try to see him in his spot, and if he was there, we would have a visit. If not, I knew I would see him in the next week or 2 weeks. The last time I saw him and then didn't, 2 weeks turned into 4 weeks, turned into months. Speaking of his invisibility, all of my questions to anyone who was on those streets, they didn't say they had ever seen such a person. And I still drive through downtown Houston looking out of the corner of my eye for Richard Kendal. But he's an ultimate mystery.
Thank you. Thank you.
How many pieces did you say?
I collected about 30 drawings of his. I suspect in his basket there could have been 100. And also Richard described a situation, these strange interactions for the homeless. I'm not sure it's the same now, but Richard would describe how on one night the police and the city would come and clear everyone's stuff out, like including his cart. And then the next night the city would show up with blankets to give everyone. And it was this give and take. And so I imagine that many of Richard's works were lost to confiscation, wouldn't be the right word, to trashing. But about 30 of them. Any more? Yes.
Instead of calling him Fred Washington, you called him Fred Johnson.
I'm sorry. Fred
Oh,
Washington.
I thought, no. I thought, well, maybe you'd really found out who
No.
Fred Washington was.
No, I did the more typical thing of making mistakes for me.
No.
Thank you, Mary Jane.
I drive to the corner of Waugh and Washington, and I always look over next to that big kind of bank building on the corner because his shop was right there, next over, maybe in the next block and a half.
Yes. It was kind of a,
Well, it was a. I think it had been a car dealership.
yeah,
And he covered over the top with plastic,
yes.
so it was not really an enclosed building.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Were you able to acquire works from all the artists in your book?
Yes. It was one of my goals after I had determined the artists who would be in the book. I didn't intend for the book to be encyclopedic or to be comprehensive in any way. What I did was choose, and I didn't have a number in mind, but I wanted to choose individual artists who illustrated versions of those life experiences of isolation from various points of view, through various experiences, and whose art was absolutely exemplary of its kind. And while we had many of the artists, of the 11 who are in the book, I needed to find a couple and now do.
Have you had a show of this work?
I've done small shows of outsider artists. I did a show of Richard Kendal's work now almost 10 years ago. I did another small show at Redbud Gallery of a variety of outsider and self-taught artists, and have a couple things in mind for the future. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you, Jay's book is available for purchase back here, and he's signing books as well.
Thank you.